was really special. So the faculty at MIT, are great, very accomplished, tops of their fields, and yet somehow there was a culture of like a priority is advising our students.
In this week's episode of The Mixtape with Scott, I had the pleasure of sitting down to talk with a professor at Brigham Young University, whose name also starts with Brigham, only his name is Brigham Frandsen. Brigham is a labor economist and an econometrician in the Brigham Young economics department. And I knew of Brigham first because of a paper he'd written on the econometrics method, instrumental variables, and an application of it called the leniency design, a paper called Judge Fixed Effects that was making a lot of the rounds about a year or 2 years ago. And I discussed it a little bit of it in my book, but I also knew about some of his work on regression discontinuity design. And then I more recently knew of his work on machine learning and instrumental variables. He's a person I just keep having to, I keep enjoying learning more about his work, and I enjoy reading him. He's a young econometrician who I think does a lot of interesting work in the area of causal inference that's usually dead center on topics that applied people like me are having to think a lot about. And those econometricians are always really interesting people to me because the work they do is always weirdly, strongly practical, strongly relevant to regular applied people, which is not always the case with econometrics in general, but is the case with Brigham's work. Today, we discussed growing up just outside of Los Angeles in a big family with a love for the outdoors, growing up wanting to be a scientist, going to college, working closely with a pillar in the Brigham Young economics department named James McDonald, who mentored Brigham as well as many other students in the department that went before him. We talked about mentorship in general, its philosophy at BYU, his own philosophies about it, what he learned from Dr. McDonald, and also the philosophies of mentorship that ultimately shaped him when he went to graduate school at MIT. But we also talked about his research, a lot of the work that he's done on distributions of heterogeneous treatment effects and bounding them, as well as the possible value that machine learning has for causal inference in general, and his thoughts about that. Full disclosure, though, I also have asked Brigham to teach a workshop at Mixtape Sessions on machine learning and causal inference. So if you found Brigham's thoughts about any of this interesting, you might come check it out. Thanks again for tuning into the podcast. I'm Scott Cunningham, the host. Okay, well, this week is my pleasure to have as a guest on the Mixtape podcast, Brigham Frandsen. Brigham, thanks for being on the podcast.
You bet, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So for the sake of the listener, can you just tell us a little, your name and what your job title and who pays you for your day, who pays you for a living?
Sure, yeah. I'm Brigham Frandsen. I am an associate professor at Brigham Young University. They, gave me the naming rights as part of the deal.
That was part of the deal.
When they hired me. So I teach economics at BYU. I've been here for about 10 years now. Love teaching, and I do research in econometrics, causal inference, also some labor economics and health economics.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Well, so tell me, where did you grow up anyway?
So I grew up in La Cañada, Flintridge, which is a small town about 15 minutes north of downtown Los Angeles in Southern California.
Oh, wow. I've never even heard of that town.
Most people haven't. So
what is it? It's a suburb of Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's a suburb of Los Angeles. And probably the last truly small town left in Southern California. It was a pretty awesome place to live, just right on the edge of the San Gabriel Mountains north of the city.
Wow. Well, so it was awesome. So what was awesome about it? What was your childhood like?
So I really lucked out with my childhood. I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters.
Oh,
So
wow.
I'm the fourth, but the oldest boy. So yeah, life was never boring. We were a pretty outdoorsy family. Like I said, we lived right on the edge of the mountains there in La Cañada. So, we spent our spring breaks and summers camping and hiking all over the West, from the Canadian Rockies down to camping out on the beach in Mexico.
Mm.
Um, so most of us in my family growing up are some combination of avid long distance runners or mountain
Oh,
bikers or soccer players. So kind of outdoors things was a big part of my growing up.
wow. Wow. What's one of your top childhood like vacation memories?
So one of my favorite vacation memories was camping out in Yellowstone National Park. We went there, actually went there a couple of times, but one of the times we were there, it just poured on us every single night. It just rained so hard, which sounds like it'd be miserable. Waking up with your sleeping bag completely sopping wet doesn't sound like much fun, but somehow it was. We were all there, we are all in it together, and
Mm.
so I'll always remember camping out in the rain in Yellowstone.
So y'all are really tight, your family,
Yeah,
all 12
we're
of you.
pretty close. There's so many of us, but we are really close. We always
Mm.
have been.
Wow. So what'd your dad do? What'd your mom and dad do for a living?
So my dad was and is a lawyer. He's a business lawyer. He has a practice there in LA. I think in his heart, he wishes he were still working the farm where he grew up.
Oh,
Um, so that's my dad. And my mom's full-time job was making sure all of us
I bet.
survived to adulthood and, uh, didn't burn the house down. She was also really active in volunteering in our community, in church and
Mm.
Girl Scouts and school board and things like that.
Wow. Wow. Did you do Boy Scouts?
Yeah, I did Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout.
You're an Eagle Scout?
Yep, I'm an Eagle Scout.
Wow. We're all are all the brothers Eagle Scouts?
I think 3 out of the 5 are Eagle Scouts. We got a couple of wayward, so I got 5 brothers, so there's 6 of us boys. I think 3 out of the 6 are Eagle Scouts.
And the other 3 didn't make it?
The other 3 didn't make it. We're
Oh
wayward.
man, that's rough. um so when you were a kid, what did you so let me ask you real quick before I forget. So of your mom and your dad, what are their favorite activities, their outdoor activities? You said of those long distance running and everything.
Yeah, so my dad, he's the one who he and my older sister kind of got everybody into long distance running. So my dad would run the LA Marathon every year. He's a marathon runner. My mom loves hiking, so she's the one who's really passionate.
Oh, she's the outdoor
camping and hiking. Yep.
Your dad, he doesn't do trail running?
He does now. He's gotten into trail running now, like in his older years. He kind of was strictly road racing, marathons, but now I think like 3 times a week he goes on like it's probably a 7-8 mile trail run, involves like 3,000 feet of elevation gain in the mornings. So yeah, he loves it.
Yeah. Those long distance runs, I've run 2 marathons, and those long distance runs for me were just like, they were really very spiritually meaningful parts of my life when I was able to do them. I mean, there's something weird, and I'm not even, I mean, obviously people talk about, runner's high, but that's not even really it. It's when you're out there for a long stretch of time, it's just really beautiful feeling.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. I love being out there, whether it's on a long mountain bike ride or on a run. And there's something, I don't know what it is. I think there's something very human about like pushing yourself. Like when you reach those limits, like you kind of confront something basic about yourself, and it's powerful.
Yeah, it's a different deal. This is what always was kind of the thing about long distance running is like like when you're not in shape and you start running, there's like a different kind of pushing yourself that you kind of push through. You've probably always been in shape, but like when you're going from being like sort of on the couch to 5K kind of thing, you like push yourself, and it's a different kind of painful because it's like not really very pleasant. But on the long distance run, you're actually in really good shape. You're in great shape, and you're pushing yourself and it's a completely different feeling because you're not really necessarily about you. I mean, sometimes you are about to collapse for sure, but it's like, it's weird how you can continue to run for a long time in a lot of pain, but actually kind of enjoy it.
Yeah, it's weird. Pain that you enjoy. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
pain that you
you know,
enjoy.
it reminds me like, maybe it's something like deeply evolutionary, like uh in our DNA, our ancestors, persistence hunting on the savannah. But yeah, something about it, like even though it's hard, it's painful, like I still love it.
Yeah. So which one do you like now? You mentioned riding bikes. So is that your favorite?
Oh yeah, I would say mountain biking is probably my favorite now. I still run, so like my kids have gotten into running,
Mm-hmm.
so and mountain biking. But so I'll run, like my daughter, my 11-year-old, she really wants to do a 10K, so she and I are training for that 10K together. Uh,
Oh,
Last year, my 13-year-old wanted to do a half marathon, so he and I trained together. We did a half marathon. So I run with my kids, and I love it. But if I'm
yeah.
just going out on my own, then I grab my bike.
You grab your bike
Yeah.
and you go for a long time.
Yeah, usually a couple, 2 or 3 hour ride.
Yeah.
Mountains around here.
Yeah. Well, so when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? Like in high
Uh,
school?
yeah, so I wanted to be a scientist.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
Yeah, but not the kind of scientist I eventually became. I wanted to be an astrophysicist.
Mm-hmm.
And that started when I was 11. So when I was 11, I found a book on the bookshelf. So our family room, like every square foot of space in our family room was lined with books, like on everything. My dad is a book addict. He just buy my mom hates it, but if he sees a book, he buys it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I found a book on our shelf. It was called Black Holes and Time Warps. It was by Kip Thorne. So he was a physicist at Caltech, which is just a few minutes down the road from La Cañada, where I grew up.
Oh.
And he's the one, so Kip Thorne, he's the one who had that famous bet with Stephen Hawking on whether black holes exist. Maybe I think
Oh
in
yeah, I know the name.
that
Okay.
movie about Stephen Hawking, like I think he was in that, and his character is in that movie. Anyway, so he wrote this book. I found it when I was 11, and I was just obsessed with astrophysics.
Oh, wow.
And that obsession lasted up until junior year in college at BYU, when I finally realized that I wasn't smart enough to cut it as an astrophysicist. So that's when I turned to economics.
You turned to economics at Brigham Young as a junior. Something happened. What is there there's like a particular course or something that a physics major might hit, or what's the where did you feel the ceiling?
Yeah, so my first exposure to economics was in high school. So I took AP Econ in high school, and I hated it. I thought it was the worst thing ever. It was like, I think basically the whole course was like memorizing the components of GDP. I was like,
Oh yeah,
this
yeah.
is so lame. So that's what I thought economics was. So like it was not on my radar at all. So yeah, I was a physics major. Sophomore year at BYU, so I was doing physics, but I had like an extra spot in my schedule, so I decided to take Econ 110. That's kind of our introductory economics class at BYU, fulfilled the GE requirement. So I took that class, and I was blown away. It was nothing like my high school economics class. Like I found it super, super fascinating. Like the idea that you could think about like human decision making and societal decision making, like in a rigorous mathematical framework,
Yeah.
really appealed to me. I was comfortable with the math from physics,
Right.
but applying it to like human questions, I found really fascinating. So took a couple of more econ classes.
Who's the teacher? Who taught you that class?
So my very first economics class was from Larry Wimmer.
Okay.
He's since retired, but he was kind of one of the OG like economists here at BYU.
Yeah.
So he taught me my first econ class. So after that, I took a couple more, and then I got involved with doing RA, like research assistant work with James McDonald.
Yeah.
He's sort of the econometric forefather here at BYU. He was Whitney Newey's undergrad advisor.
Oh wow.
So yeah, that's James McDonald. I was really lucky to have
He's still there?
him here. He's technically retired, but he still comes in and still works with students and is still working on research stuff.
Yeah. So wait, you were his RA. You took econometrics. So so you take that class from, I forgot the professor's name that took your,
Wimmer.
Yeah, Wimmer. And you're sort of seeing for the first time something about behavior, human behavior, that you hadn't seen in that AP class. So it's like micro.
Yeah, it was really micro that kind of like really sparked it. I guess AP Econ in high school was mostly macro.
Right.
Now I've learned to tolerate macro too, but it was really the like microeconomic frameworks that kind of like opened my mind to how powerful economics could be.
I mean, it could go either way. It's like, a person that wants to be a scientist, that's a physicist. You could tell me a story about how that person saw macro, and that was like so similar, but what's the common thread between micro and your passion for that Kip Thorne stuff? Is there some kind of theme that's like not obvious to somebody else, but that's obvious to you?
Yeah. So I think the common theme is like both get at what feels like something very fundamental. So when you study physics, you really get the feeling that you're kind of uncovering like fundamental laws of like the way the universe works. And that kind of purity in physics is what attracted me to physics. And microeconomics, is a little bit the same thing. At least that's what it aspires to kind of get at the fundamental like drivers of how humans and societies make the decisions that they make. So I think that's the common thread, that they're really trying to get at kind of the fundamental forces that drive the way things work.
Yeah. So what you were like, so you thinking in terms of like utility and like the objectives of a person, those kinds of things were.
That's right. Yeah.
That sort of the stuff?
What are the underlying objectives? And even even a utility function is kind of an abstraction. Like in one of my undergrad classes taught by Val Lamson, we kind of took the axiomatic approach to preferences. So this is even deeper than utility functions.
Yeah.
And I love that. Like when you kind of lay things out in terms of like the axioms,
totally.
And then you really feel like, okay, I'm here at the fundamentals. And
yeah.
That was really.
Yeah, I taught grad micro at Baylor for 10 years, and you have to start at those axioms of choice and build up from there. And but I've never spent nearly as much time in the axioms of choice as you might get from what I've seen of some pure theory courses will do. And it's deep and wonderful. I mean, it's really interesting the amount of work that's gone in by economists before us on thinking so deeply about that and what we've been able to construct from it.
It is pretty amazing. Yeah.
So Dr. McDonald, so you graduate in 2004 and you basically publish as an undergrad. It looks like I saw on your Vita, you've got an 2006 paper on lasers, which is 2 years after you graduate, but you got this 2004 paper with McDonald in Journal of Income Distribution. Just thinking about that second one, is that common at Brigham Young to publish with your professors?
Yeah, that's one of the remarkable things about BYU. It's a very undergraduate focused institution. There are some graduate programs, but it's really focused on undergraduate education. And so the opportunities that undergrads can get at BYU to be involved in the research process, even to co-author, is common at BYU, but I've come to see that it's pretty extraordinary, like in terms of other undergraduate research institutions where maybe most of your classes are taught by grad students, or things like that. So that is one thing that makes BYU a remarkable place, is the degree to which as an undergrad, you can be involved in doing real research.
Yeah.
But
this was like econometrics.
Yeah. So
this was like with Professor McDonald. It's a paper on measurement error. So what was this? Did this come out of what's the origin of that paper?
Yeah. So this came out of I got involved doing RA work for James McDonald, and his kind of specialty, the mark, he's what he was known for was like using flexible distribution functional forms to like, to capture various features of distribution, so including the income distribution.
Oh, wow.
And so I got interested in econometrics. That was sort of like, as a physicist coming into economics, it was a really natural point of entry. So started doing RA work for him, and honestly, like, he kind of made it his calling, I think. So he made a lot of contributions. He's published in Econometrica and things like that earlier in his career, but he kind of made it his calling to like mentor or shepherd us students and like work with us really, really closely and let us see the whole research process from beginning to end. So it was really a privilege to work so closely with James McDonald and kind of see how it works, see what the research process is, learned that I loved. I got to see what it was like, learned that I loved it, and kind of decide to go that way in my career.
Since you've been on both sides of the fence, you were a student that wrote an applied econometrics paper with him, and now you are a professor and an econometrician. How would you, now he's kind of stepping back, what was his production function that allowed him to both be in the position of an autonomous researcher and bring about publishing with the students? Because it's easy to sort of aspire to it, but there is a production function involved. It requires kind of a lot of multi-steps, and I don't think any of us get trained in it. So what do you think he did exactly?
So what he did was he had like a pretty interesting approach. So I don't know if you've ever seen like sheepdogs, but sheepdogs are kind of big around here. Like, but the way sheepdogs are trained is like, okay, there's the shepherd, the human, and he's got a sheepdog, but there's always like a master sheepdog and an apprentice sheepdog. And oftentimes, like, the master sheepdog will be training the apprentice sheepdog. So James McDonald usually worked with 2 RAs at a time, and they would kind of overlap. So I would work closely with James McDonald and also the RA who preceded me, who happened to be Bob Turley. He went on to get his PhD at Harvard. And then once Bob graduated, then I was the master sheepdog, RA, and I helped to kind of train up the next one. So he kind of which was great, because as you know, like when you teach something to somebody else, that's when you really learn it. So yeah, like I would learn from him and from the other RA, but then when I had a chance to help train the new RA who was up and coming, that's when I really learned it. And so that's kind of how he operated. He always had 2 RAs at a time, worked really intensively with us. It was a
what does that mean, worked really intensively? What was he doing?
So like we would meet every day,
every day.
We would meet every day, every afternoon we'd meet. And I kind of given an update on what I found. We'd talk about bottlenecks. He'd help me through them. So
bottlenecks on like a proof, or bottlenecks coding, of like coding thing.
Yeah, maybe some coding wasn't giving what I expected, or some results looked funny, and I've been banging my head against it, and we'd talk through it, and he'd point out, okay, try this and try that. So just the sheer amount of time, and he did devote a lot of time to it. I have no doubt that he could have done what we were doing in like a third of the time.
Yeah.
But he made that part of what his contribution was going to be to economics, and he chose to do that. So, and I'm grateful. It made a big difference in my life.
So do you have a production function that is different than his in terms of like mentoring? And yeah, also before I even say that, do you think of yourself as a mentor?
I aspire to that. James McDonald is really, he made a big difference for me here at BYU, and I aspire to make that kind of difference for my students. And so my model is similar. I usually work with relatively small number of RAs, like one or two, and try to work closely with them and kind of give them the same sort of support and mentoring that I got from James McDonald. I'm, not there yet. Those are big shoes to fill, but that's what I try to do.
But those time inputs, those frequent time inputs are a part of the production function of mentoring that leads to publishing.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's no substitute for just putting the time in and, sitting down together and thinking through things.
Wow. So then you graduate in 2004 and you end up going to MIT. Was there, it's so like I write, the thing is to me, going to MIT, it would just to have gotten that acceptance letter in the mail. I can only imagine in my mind, I'm imagining you as a college student, how that would have just been so meaningful. Because, MIT is just like the University of Alabama of college football. It's just such like an incubator of the future of economics. So I was wondering, what was it like to get that, what were you thinking about in terms of what you wanted to do with your life, and what was it? What were your thought processes around MIT and then getting in?
Yeah, it was a really cool place. And when I found out that I was accepted and that I would have the option of going there, like it was really meaningful. And I attribute that to James McDonald.
Really? Is he an alumni? Was he an alumni of MIT?
No, he didn't go to MIT. He didn't go to MIT. He went to Purdue. But so like I say, he had been Whitney Newey's advisor when Whitney Newey was an undergrad at BYU. And Whitney Newey, of course, had been the chair.
McDonald was Whitney Newey's advisor?
Yeah, James McDonald was Whitney Newey's advisor when Whitney Newey was an undergrad at BYU.
Get out of here. So, wow. I didn't catch you said that. I thought it was the other way around. Okay.
No. So that was a pretty
that's incredible.
And so just having that kind of connection between BYU and MIT, and there have been a string of other people going from BYU to MIT. So so Chris Hansen, he was out of BYU, went to MIT. Jim Curl is one of our older faculty. He was at MIT, and then there've been a few others. My same year there, Randall Lewis.
But is it the James McDonald? Is it the James McDonald played kind of he's a big part of that conduit?
It is the James McDonald. He's the common thread.
So get out of here.
I attribute it all to him, but I benefited from that.
Wow. That's got to be pretty heavy on you guys that are there now, kind of feeling like, I'm just imagining you're sort of, if you all sit around and think, okay, McDonald, we owe a lot to McDonald, but look at what he did. He spent a ton of time with students. He invested in is that that's kind of that's got to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would think that would weigh heavy on a lot of the faculty there, that the key to investing in these students is way beyond just prepping these classes.
It is. That definitely kind of what he did, and he wasn't the only faculty member who did that sort of thing, really did kind of set the culture of what our department here is about. Part of it's self-serving. So because of the nature of BYU, it's a church-affiliated university, and for the most part, we hire faculty who are members of the church. So that's a pretty small hiring pool. Yeah. And so we really have a vested interest in mentoring our students, sending them to good places. So
sure.
It's in our interest as well to help kind of grow the future of our department. Our students may well become our colleagues one day. And
absolutely.
Feel that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of Brigham Young is kind of like in that space of like Dartmouth, doesn't have a PhD program and just has this really impeccable, highly impactful faculty in terms of their research productivity. It's just phenomenal, and I think of you as part of that. That's great. I didn't realize it was McDonald or he was a big part of that.
That's really cool. Right.
Wow.
It is.
So you got in, and so I mean, you must have been just so. What was it? What was the first? What was your first impressions like of the school or the department?
So MIT was a really cool place. Part of it is my peers, my fellow grad students, were like my cohort and the cohorts above and below who we interacted with a lot. Like one, they're all crazy smart.
Yeah.
And so supportive. So and it's maybe like this everywhere, but such supportive fellow grad students, so smart, and kind of people come from different backgrounds. We had students from Europe, students from South America, students from Asia.
How big's the cohort? How big was your cohort?
So 20, I think 24 students.
Is that, and they basically all or is there much attrition?
No, there's not much attrition.
And y'all don't have prelims, right?
The model is not, let's admit a bunch of people and then winnow them out.
It's not the Chicago model.
People. Yeah, I think Chicago maybe is changing that over time.
That's historically was their model though, right? Chicago would let in a lot and then sort of took a lot of chances on I mean, they had a reason for it. They took a lot of chances at the margin on students and then they would see. But but you guys didn't have prelims, right?
So we didn't have prelims. Nope, there are no prelims. We had general exams like at the end, but there were no qualifying exams, in the first year to know people out. Yeah, that wasn't MIT's model. It was very supportive. So my fellow grad students were fantastic. And then the faculty, obviously, and this is something that it was really special. So the faculty at MIT, are great, very accomplished, tops of their fields, and yet somehow there was a culture of a priority is advising our students and spending time with them. And again, it's about time. It's not, it's like meeting several times a week with your advisors and spending. They would devote a good chunk of their time to advising students and helping them succeed, basically. And it's in the
DNA really of the school, right? It's in the DNA of the department. Because I think I read once, I thought that the originator of that is kind of Paul Samuelson, that he had sort of, when he helped start the department, it just sort of had such a strong focus on mentoring of mentoring. Is that accurate, or have you heard that too?
I think that's my understanding as well, that Paul Samuelson kind of from the beginning, he sort of was the one who created MIT economics.
Yeah.
And just from the beginning kind of instituted that culture of we're gonna prioritize advising grad students. And it persists. I'm not an organizational behavior person, but somehow that culture seems to persist and make a difference.
Well, so what did it look like in your personal life? How would you describe what that looked like to someone who's an economist but has never been to MIT? What do you think is the salient features of what it was like for you, of finding a professor and getting invested in and all that stuff?
Yeah, so the way it worked for me was, first semester, doing coursework, I took a labor economics class from Josh Angrist, and I think the faculty must kind of be looking for students that they can connect with one way or another. And so I was interested in labor economics. I was also interested in mountain biking. And Josh is a very avid and skilled mountain biker. And so actually our first interaction kind of outside of class was, hey, let's go for a ride. So we started mountain biking. We mountain biked, once or twice a week, all through, my first year. And when you're out on a ride, you're talking about research. I'm asking him about what he's doing. He was working on a book project at the time, became mostly harmless, econometrics.
Oh, yeah.
And
I've heard of that book.
So, you remember that book?
I saw something on the internet about it.
So, yeah, I kind of, so he said, I asked if I'd be interested in kind of helping out with some RA stuff on that book. And that's just how it happened.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, kind of transitioning a little bit. I had even more questions I wanted to ask you about, but I volunteered this semester. So interesting, Baylor, where I'm a professor, we've taught since the school's founding, continuously every year, this history of economic thought class. It was taught by Judge Baylor, the first president and founder. But then my colleague retired, and it was going to be orphaned. And I kind of come from I'm the opposite of you. You came from physics. I came from English and literature, and I didn't have any econ in my background before graduate school. So I volunteered to teach it and like learn all these stuff. I didn't know anything. Well, it's been really interesting. Like everything I do about Adam Smith was the invisible hand stuff you could kind of fit on a bumper sticker. It's like invisible hand and like markets and all this stuff. But I did not know how interested and concerned he and the other classical economists were in labor. He was in particular very concerned about workers and capitalism. And I just, was kind of thinking, why do you study topics in labor? Why is it that you think labor economics is a topic that is worth your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've also been impressed. When I go back and read Adam Smith, there's a lot there. Amazing. So labor for me, my interest in labor is a little bit like it stems from like partially the stuff I did with James McDonald when I was an undergrad on distributions. And he was interested in like mathematical flexible functional forms for distributions, and I find myself being really interested in the distributions of outcomes across people. We spend a lot of time, like our typical applied work estimates average effects. And I found myself wondering, well, what is that average effect masking? It could be masking very different experiences for different people. And so that was kind of my entry into labor questions, and specifically unions. It was probably my first year labor economics class at MIT. We talked about this famous regression discontinuity study by DiNardo and Lee, where they use union elections. And they famously found kind of very minimal effects of unions on average. And so my first thought was, okay, maybe the average effect is quite small, but maybe there's like large but offsetting effects of different parts of the distribution. So kind of thinking about distributional effects is what got me interested in labor. And then that kind of continues to be a big part of like my econometric research today is thinking.
So even in that early journal of income distribution, you were thinking about distributional questions, just not, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but not treatment effects.
Not treatment effects, that's right, but still thinking about.
But thinking about these of distribution, heterogeneity in a population.
That's right.
Yeah. And you see that is connected to labor too, not just pure econometrics, but like those were labor questions. Those were relevant labor questions.
Yeah, that's right. So they were relevant labor questions. Kind of you think about the biggest change in the labor markets over the past 30 years, and there's big institutional changes like the decline of unions, or changes in minimum wage, things like that. And most of those are like where they really bite is what do they do to the distribution of outcomes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's really classical too. I mean, I think like the thing is, I mean, these questions of inequality within a prosperous society are like from the very, very beginning. The other thing that's been impressing me about this history of thought class that, I mean, it's like really kind of obvious, but like until you see these old guys do it, for some reason you didn't really notice it, was they were so focused on, a lot of them were really concerned about, they were concerned about people, but they were weird because they would do so much technical, even abstract, deeply mathematical work about people. And, it's interesting because that's you too, right? You have all this you're a labor economist and you're this highly technical, abstract econometrician too. And that fits in your work with labor, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about, like, for the sake of somebody that doesn't really know anything about economics or labor, how would those two things even go together?
Yeah, I think they do go together. And like when you get involved with, thinking about distributions and thinking about treatment effects, it quickly becomes, a challenge, like econometrically or, empirically, to try to identify these effects on distributions. They're, it's just inherently more involved than thinking about average effects. And so the kind of mathematical tools that you need to tackle distributional questions are just going to be a bit more involved in what you need to tackle averages. And then doing so, the traditional way that economists have dealt with distributions is by, making strong assumptions about the functional form of things. We'll assume such and such is log normal, or, something else is, extreme value type 2, or whatever it is. But there you're kind of baking in the answer that you're going to find when you make these really strong assumptions.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So like a big priority, I think, for this line of research and for me is to be able to tackle distributional questions, which I think are really fundamental questions in labor economics for society having to do with inequality, but to do so without having to make like really strong, maybe artificial assumptions.
Yeah.
And like, to make headway without making these,
because you feel like if you make these really strong distribution, like, so you sort of a priori start saying, I'm going to make these assumptions. Economists were doing that because then things become tractable. But you're sort of thinking
tractable.
But you're thinking they comes at a really high price because it's obscuring what could be true. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And with any research, and this isn't just economics, like the number one question we should be asking ourselves is, to what extent are the conclusions driven by like the assumptions that we've baked in? And to what extent are they driven by, what the data is trying to tell us?
Right.
And if you can make headway without making strong assumptions, then you can have more faith that the conclusions you're drawing are really what the data are telling you, and not really baked in by making assumptions. So that's been a priority for me in my research, and I think a lot of modern econometrics is trying to make headway in this same direction. What can we say, stripping out some of the strong assumptions that we used to make in the past? And it turns out it's harder. It's a harder mathematical and econometric challenge to make headway when you don't have all these assumptions that can kind of provide structure. But I think that's been a big area of progress, though, in the past few years in econometrics.
So is it correct to say that this work of yours on bounding, is it and bounds and this kind of like, less assumptions approach to the distribution of these treatment effects? Is that primarily with Lars Lefgren? Has he been your primary co-author on that kind of research agenda?
Yeah, he has been. And Lars is my colleague here at BYU.
Okay.
And it's very much in this vein. As soon as you start stripping away, some of our assumptions that we might have made in the past, like you might lose. There's trade-offs to everything. So when you strip away an assumption, you might lose the ability to pin down, to point identify, as we say, but to pin down the exact answer to a question. But what you might be able to do is to put an upper and lower bound. So here's an example. So a paper that we have, it looks at charter schools. And charter schools, in some cases, have been spectacularly successful. But the question you ask is, okay, maybe some students really benefit from charter schools, but maybe some students are harmed by charter schools and might do better in a traditional setting.
Yeah.
So even though charter schools might, certain charter schools might be really successful on average, we want to know, what fraction of students might actually be harmed, what fraction of students benefit from charter schools. It's kind of one of these basic distributional questions that we talked about before.
Yeah.
And it turns out, like, even a question that simple, what fraction of students, might be harmed by some intervention, like, without making really, really strong assumptions, it's not a question that you can answer in an exact way, but you can put an upper and lower bound. We can say, at most, this fraction of students were harmed by charter schools, and if we're able to say that at most 1% of students were harmed by charter schools, well, then we've learned something. Sure, we haven't been able to pin down what the exact percentage is, but we've learned something valuable. If you're able to put a bound on what the effect might be, that's informative. And so as soon as you're willing to kind of embrace ambiguity that way and be okay with bounds, it turns out you can actually you can remove quite a few of your assumptions and just kind of let the data.
What were people doing before this paper with Lefgren? I mean, I think about like, you know, everybody knows, not everybody knows, but like, you know, there's work by Mansky and partial identification. Like what exactly is the value added approach of what y'all are doing?
So before our paper, there were kind of two basic approaches. On one extreme is Mansky, as you mentioned, and actually, I really find Mansky's approach appealing, which is let's not make any assumptions that we can't explicitly justify. But you know, and I respect that. Oftentimes, though, what you arrive at is really, really wide bounds. It turns like you can't really say much about anything if you know, if you strip away so many assumptions. So that's kind of one extreme, like really wide bounds that aren't informative. The other extreme is the opposite. Let's make a lot of really strong assumptions. So one strong assumption is what they call, you know, rank invariance or something. Which that does allow you to pin down answers to questions like what fraction of students might have been hurt or harmed by charter schools. But these really strong assumptions put they assume away a lot of heterogeneity, and they and then you wonder how much of my conclusion is being drawn by this really strong assumption. So those were kind of the two approaches: either make super strong assumptions that you probably don't believe, or make really, really weak assumptions that don't tell you anything. And we hope we've been able to bridge that gap by proposing.
Is there like a core concept that I should like be taking away from this work with Lars that's like rank invariance or something that's like something I can remember?
Yeah, so the core concept, you know, we call it, it has a terrible name, stochastic increasingness. But
oh yeah, that's intimidating.
But basically what the assumption that allows us to make headway is to say, okay, we don't know how, like, okay, the fundamental problem of causality, of course, is that you don't get to see a given individual in both states of the world where they attended charter schools or at the same time attended a traditional school. You only get to see one or the other, right? That's kind of the fundamental problem of causal inference. But we can make an assumption about those two states of the world. We can say, okay, students who tended to do better in, you know, in charter schools, if we can say like students who tended to do better in charter schools would not necessarily have done better in traditional schools, but on average would have done better in traditional schools than students who fared worse in charter schools. That actually allows us to put pretty informative bounds on things. So this
how'd y'all get that idea? Where'd that come from? Y'all just sit and talk about that?
This concept of stochastic increasingness, you know, it's been around. It's been floating around in old school like statistics texts for a long time. I'm looking at my shelf of the book that it was in. It's a very weak notion of correlation. It's like it's related to positive correlation, but weaker. And applying it to like distributional questions, you know, it just Lars Lefgren and I batting ideas around, you know, mostly taking walks in the mountains up around campus. That's where we do our best thinking. You know, it just seemed to us like a pretty reasonable assumption. It's one that you can actually test. And so we gave it a go, and it turned out like just imposing just that one assumption actually allowed us to narrow the bounds and really like home in on answers to these distributional questions.
Well, so if you could like, you know, somebody that's listening on the podcast and they're like, I wonder if I need to care about this stuff that Brigham and Lars are working on, but they don't know how to recognize immediately from what you've just said that they should be paying more attention. What's kind of like the big applied questions that you would say, and if you're doing this kind of thing, you might be someone who would really benefit from this kind of making the fixed cost investment to kind of learn a little bit more about, you know, bounds. Like who are the likely candidates at the extensive margin that don't know they need this?
Yeah, so I think people who are interested in like the impacts of like policy interventions, and who are especially concerned about whether some people might be harmed and some people might be hurt
Got it.
by policy interventions. That those are the kind of people who I think could benefit from understanding what our work is, and then maybe even using it in their own policy evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, thinking, so it's like you've got to, so you've got to be probably working on something where you sort of have an a priori reason to think there's kind of some downside potentially to the treatment that at least is worth kind of digging into a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So before we kind of end, this other thing that you've been working on, which you haven't really mentioned, and I guess you're just kind of a Renaissance kind of econometrician. You've also been doing all this stuff on machine learning, or at least you've made the big investment in that. Machine learning is kind of funny because I always kind of think like the people that have used so much of it outside of econ, they've used it for kind of traditional prediction questions. And I used to kind of think, well, causal inference really isn't about prediction. But the more that I've thought about causal inference, it is kind of about prediction, because you're predicting counterfactuals. And if you correctly predict a counterfactual, well, then you also could maybe even predict the future too. But I was wondering, how do you think about how machine learning and causal inference go together? I mean, because they've not been traditionally, it's not like that. It's not like the pioneers of it were necessarily using it in the way that you sort of see it potentially, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I see the introduction of these machine learning tools in econometrics as kind of following the same vein as we've seen in economics before. Like if you look at the recent history of economics, it's a history of like seeing that ideas in other disciplines can be super useful in economics. So think about psychology. Think about what an influence like a lot of ideas that were original in psychology now have on behavioral economics.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is true for computer science. So economists, kind of recently have looked over at computer scientists or statisticians and said, hey, they're actually doing some really neat stuff over there. They're not directly trying to answer the same questions we're trying to answer, but they're developing tools that can be really useful for us. And so I think a lot of economists and econometricians have realized that prediction, even if prediction isn't directly answering the kind of questions that we're interested in answering, causal effects, things like that, prediction can be used as a valuable input to answer these questions. So, and if you think about, our most basic econometric tool, which is a regression, where we control for a bunch of covariates, like you can cast that as a prediction problem. Like the way, multiple regression works, you can think of it as we're going to predict our outcome with all these covariates. We're going to predict our treatment with all these covariates, and we're going to, in the end, like adjust our estimate of the treatment effect to account for, the relationship with all these covariates. And so we recognize that even these pure prediction problems can be used as inputs into the econometric process, and ultimately, the hope is make our analysis more robust, less dependent on functional form assumptions.
Right.
Grapple with problems of overfitting that we've really kind of ignored in econometrics, but turn out can be a big deal. The weak instruments literature, the many instruments literature has kind of recognized that overfitting is something that we as economists should be thinking about. Computer scientists have been thinking about that for a long time and have a lot to teach us. Right.
I was still though, I saw your paper with Josh Angrist, and you were looking at, I thought at sort of a, using machine learning in combination with instrumental variables. And it seemed like the paper, you're a little bit more ambivalent about the usefulness of machine learning for IV. And I was surprised because I knew of Victor Chernyshkov's work that kind of had sort of bridged them. And I guess I was just, I don't know enough about all of the areas of IV and machine learning, but I was just wondering, just at a high level, I guess, for the sake of the reader, what was that study about with Josh, and what What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so we looked at kind of two areas where machine learning might be promising to like help with econometric inference. One of those is instrumental variables, IV, and the other one is kind of traditional regression with controls.
Yeah.
And we kind of got two different messages from these two different areas. So instrumental variables, one way machine learning could be used there is to help pick your instruments.
Yeah.
Or to help basically to do the first stage, which is a prediction problem.
Right.
And so think about bias of two-stage least squares when you have many instruments. Machine learning does help to bias. It just doesn't help as much as some tools that we already have. We already have tools like limited information maximum likelihood is a tool that's kind of already been around. Tools like jackknife instrumental variables or split sample IV. It turns out those already do a pretty darn good job. And in fact, especially like jackknife IV, it actually uses some important like concepts from the machine learning field, like splitting your sample, not using the same observations for training your model as prediction. So we had kind of already absorbed those lessons and kind of solved the problem already. And there really wasn't any more benefit to kind of bringing in lasso or other things. At least that's what we found.
Is it just a problem of not a benefit, or is it also a problem of like, there's also like additional biases that are something that it might do?
There are some additional biases. So when you use these machine learning tools, they're not free, like, so for example, it comes with its own set of assumptions like sparsity that need to be true for it to work. So it's not free. And if those assumptions aren't satisfied, then they can actually cause some harm. And so on net, like kind of our existing ways of dealing with these problems of instrumental variables bias ended up being superior to bring in these machine learning tools. So that was our kind of conclusion for IV. But for regression control, actually, we found that machine learning was a very fruitful way to kind of gauge robustness to functional form, to help grapple with the problem of many covariates, and ended up proving to us to be a pretty promising tool.
Yeah. So you feel like, I mean, your overall feeling about machine learning being useful for causal inference, I mean, and for applied workers in general, I mean, do you feel like it's worth a person's time to sort of invest in these things? Because it's always so expensive. It's so expensive to learn anything.
There's fixed costs to developing a new set of tools. I think it absolutely is worth it. I think the machine learning tools that have been developing in computer science do have a lot to offer, both academic economists, but especially economists who might find themselves working kind of outside of academia.
Totally.
Dealing with big data alone, like learning some of the tools for dealing with big data, I think are a valuable addition to the toolkit for economists everywhere. And it's, just like we saw, like psychology added so much to economics, I think machine learning tools are going to add a lot to econometrics.
Awesome.
I think the methods are here to stay.
Well, it's top of the hour. I really appreciate this time. It was really nice getting to talk. And thanks so much for letting me get to learn a little bit more about your life and your work.
Great talking to you, Scott. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.